Okay, well, welcome back to the book club playlist on this YouTube channel. And today we're going to be talking about not necessarily about science, but about art and music. And so I'm going to review a book that's called, here it is, Dangerous Rhythms, Jazz and the Underworld. Now, so before we get started, if you like this video, go on the YouTube website and like the video and click on the bell and get notified for more, and check out my website for other kinds of information, and then you'll be edified. So this book is a new book. It came out in 2022 by T.J. English, who is a person who's been studying the underworld, the mafia and so forth, organized crime, for quite some time. And that got him into thinking and learning about jazz music, musicians and so forth. So he's written this book. And the introduction of this book, it points out that the book really isn't about jazz, the music. It's a book really these are my words, about the sociology or the civics of the evolution of this form of music, which has been called the classic American music, because the society really essentially shaped the evolution of this whole genre. And it's quite interesting given where we are in 2022 in our evolution of our society. In particular, and it starts out in the latter part of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century, when segregation and racism, anti-Black racism, was running rampant, and they were lynching people in the South, particularly right and left, for up until the 30s, essentially. And so it's about the racism of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant people who originally settled our world here in the New World, and how they dealt with then, on the one hand, the slaves and then the descendants of the slaves, as well as the immigrants coming from other countries with other ethnic backgrounds and culture, religions, and how they dealt with them, because they all figured in to different occupations that shaped jazz as we have come to know it in our society. Starts out with a very interesting discussion of a very famous song called "Strange Fruit" that Billie Holiday sang in 1939. And it was Time magazine in 1999 called it the song of the century, or labeled it the song of the century. And it's really about lynching, and the strange fruit that she describes in the song are the Black bodies hanging from the poplar trees and with blood all over them. So that led me to say to myself, well, I better find out about it. I don't think I knew that song particularly, so I went online and I think what my advice in this particular book is to go on YouTube, and when you come across a singer or a musician and a particular song that this fellow T.J. English focuses on in the book, you can look it up. You can watch it on your computer, and it really adds, because, as I said, the book is not about the music and about there's some descriptions of the different aspects of jazz, what made it special in terms of a musical genre versus what was already out there, or versus what has come from that. But it's so nice. It adds a lot. It'll add a lot to your enjoyment of this book. So the other thing and this is where T.J. English came from, is that right at the same time that jazz started to become a thing, organized crime was starting to become a thing in our country, as opposed to just petty crime or crimes of passion that would happen in any society. Organized crime as something that was really shaped during the same time period as jazz and used jazz as a vehicle to run their businesses. And that's one of the reasons that they sort of co-evolved in this whole process. So this book is divided into two different parts. Part one deals with the end of the 19th century and up until really the through the 1930s, 40s, and into the 50s, or into the 40s essentially, and it focuses and that's part one, and part two takes the story then from the 50s on up until the present time, and the TJ English focuses on two musicians and performers who were sort of emblematic of these two different eras of the evolution of jazz. In the first, it's Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong was born, I don't have the exact date, the end of the 19th century, just the beginning of the 20th. And he was in New Orleans. And New Orleans was really where the music came from, the plantations and from the days of slavery, from originating in Africa in terms of the rhythms and the beats and so forth that they would sing in the cotton fields and so forth. That it began to be in the cities. The cities were really the important things in terms of jazz. And in the cities, the business was sin. That was what was really making the money, essentially. And so in New Orleans particularly, they had all kinds of bordellos and houses of prostitution all over the place, and that's where they also had musicians, and the jazz musicians were essentially almost all black, and that's the only place they played. That was before they had such things as cabarets and cafes and other establishments where people would eat and drink and also hear the music and have a floor show or something of that sort. So that basically in the beginning, the music was considered by the WASPs to be, that wasn't their music. That was the music of those other people, the ones that they were subjugating and lynching and so forth. From the standpoint of, if you happen to be a musician like Louis Armstrong, it was sort of a high-risk occupation because not only from the authorities would every now and then raid your house of prostitution and whatever else, and you'd find yourself carted off to jail. But then, as time went on, the bordellos and so forth were financed and taken over by organized crime. Seemed like a good idea. That's where you went. That's where you went to have sin, and therefore, if you happen to be a musician, so like Louis, and you were playing in one of those houses, you didn't cross the boss. It was not a good idea, and that's gone into in spades in this book, and many anecdotal stories of what went on in terms of what the profession of the musicians were like. Essentially, they were chattel and being ruled by the society and also by the mob. The societal aspect of things and the waspy part of the whole thing was originated in government that started right after the American Revolution, 1786. A society was formed that was called Tammany Hall in New York City by the upper class business people and so forth. And that throughout then the 19th century, from 1800 on, the politics of the large cities, originating first in New York, but then also in New Orleans and so forth, as we'll get into, there were politicians who formed themselves took it upon themselves to decide to keep the good stuff to themselves, to make sure they made money, and to regulate and control the business of sin. And so what happened is that in New Orleans, where Louis Armstrong was sort of holding forth as just a kid. I mean, he started in the business when he was like 17 and playing the cornet, and then and he was really recognized early on as being special. The way he blew his horn was different from anybody else that had come before him, and he went from one place to another in terms of, and as he aged and grew up and so forth, he realized that he basically needed protection. He needed protection from the other mob people, and he needed protection from the government itself. And so he started relationships with the mafia early on, and the mafia was, of course, ever since Al Capone in the 30s, in the 20s and in the 30s, we've always associated with the mafia with the Italians, but the Irish immigrants also had their own mafias, and they really infiltrated and into the political sphere, so that they became the sort of the bosses of Tammany Hall in New York, and then in New Orleans they had another counterpart, and in Kansas City and in Chicago, similar kinds of things went on. And so there's a lot of stories in the book and anecdotes in the book that are presented as true, and I don't have any reason to suspect that they weren't, of how Louis Armstrong dealt with these different kinds of things. Well, in the teens and then in the early 20s, the riverboats plying up and down the Mississippi River took this whole jazz. First of all, they had, so the riverboats were sort of neat. They had gambling, they had drinking, and they had sex, and they had jazz. And so what else do you need? Huh? And so Kansas City became colonized by jazz musicians, and they had a whole governmental organization that was regulating things in Kansas City, is just like they had in New Orleans. And so for a while, for about a decade or more, Kansas City was really everybody. The word went out. This is, if you want to get into the sin, go to Kansas City. You don't have to go to Paris or Copenhagen or anything like that. In the 20s, because of things just really cracked wide open because of prohibition, and that's one of the reasons that I say that the civics of this whole thing, the society, our North American Puritan society, really spearheaded by the WTCU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, got together with the pastors of all the Protestant churches, and they pushed the whole idea that that the drunkenness that was going on, particularly by these terrible Catholic people, from drinking beer like the Germans and drinking wine like the Italians, and coming home and beating their wives and all this other stuff. They called it the noble experiment, which was prohibition, that was voted in as an amendment to the Constitution in 1919 and took effect the very next year in 1920. That was just a wonderful thing to the mafia, because it allowed them to sort of go 10x to 100x in terms of their income, their revenue from their businesses. They did gambling, they did prostitution, and so forth. But then in the 20s, when prohibition was in, they smuggled in booze from all over the place, particularly Canada, and they bring it in barrels and so forth. And there was one anecdote in the book where they said there were 30,000 speakeasies in New York City. And the thing about prohibition, it's a little bit different than our current day war on drugs, which I'll get into, is that there were an awful lot of people that wanted to drink. It wasn't that there's just a fraction of the populace. it was probably at least half, maybe more. So that there was a market that was very thirsty, and there were the officials in the cities would and the police could be bought off and corrupted, so that everybody had their hand in the till, and everybody was winning except the musicians. They were employed, but they basically were employees of the mafia for the most part throughout the roaring 1920s. And so it only took them about a decade to realize, took them, I mean, the whole populace of the country, to realize that this prohibition thing did not work. And so that you can't legislate the behavior of people, particularly in a so-called free and democratic society. They made it easier to get rid of this prohibition thing by another amendment to the Constitution that was passed in 1933, just 13 years later, because they changed the rules from, you had to have 3/4 of the legislatures, the state legislatures, to pass an amendment to the Constitution. But somewhere along in there, they changed it from the legislatures of the states to the state conventions. Well, I mean, the state conventions, the conventions got together. They passed that very rapidly, so that in 1933, prohibition was over. But by then, the mafia and all the other aspects of organized crime and the government officials and so forth had been in business for more than a decade. And that brought in, then they realized, and I'm going to get into that on another book that we're going to review in this book club. They realized that they needed to replace that with something, otherwise they'd be out of business. And so they replaced it with the war on drugs, beginning in the 1930s and then ramping up in the 1970s and so forth to the 80s, with Nancy Reagan saying, just say no. And so I think we're all more familiar with that whole story. The second part of the book, so I'll stop there in terms of the first part of the book. The second part of the book, the main character that is focused on is Frank Sinatra, who was born or came from Hoboken in New Jersey, of Irish immigrant parents. And so he grew up basically hard scrabble. He knew what the street was all about. And early on, and when he was just a teenager, he started performing and really liked it. And his hero at that point in time was Bing Crosby. And this is something that I didn't really appreciate. Bing Crosby was singing, crooning these ballads and so forth that were really sung in a different way than had been done prior to that. He had a very mellifluous voice, baritone, and he would talk to you essentially. He basically talked to you. And Frank Sinatra thought, well, this is a great way to sing, and he emulated him and tried to become like Bing, and ultimately he did become like Bing, and you can argue bigger than Bing. And so the whole second part of the book traces the evolution of the music and the characters that were the musicians and the singers, and how they changed the whole thing. And so the big band sounds of the 1940s were Duke Ellington, for example, and Tommy Dorsey and so forth. Those and swing as a dance form of jazz, essentially, that came out of jazz and came out of the changes that were happening in the music. New York City became a real focus during that time, and they were jazz clubs all over the place. And in particular, they focused on 52nd Street in New York, which I know quite well. And one of the things that they mentioned in the book is the fact that it was just one jazz club after another all the way up and down 52nd 52nd Street between 5th and 6th Avenue. Now you go on 52nd Street, you wouldn't have any idea that that was what was going on back in the day, you know? Well, so that in the 50s, then the mafia were looking for other ways to have fun and make money, and they went down to Havana, Cuba, and so the 50s, it was just a nirvana of gambling and drinking and prostitutions and anything you would want. You had Sin City down there. So that didn't last forever, because in 1959, when Fidel Castro came in, that ended. And then with that, ultimately, they retracted from their ambitions. They wanted to go worldwide at that stage. Jazz as a discipline and entertainment and music gravitated to Hollywood and LA, and then into Las Vegas, which was a whole city created in the desert where hopefully nobody would bother them. So I'm going to stop there and not move on to other things, because I don't want to ruin this book for you. I think it's a fascinating book, and I recommend it highly. We'll stop there, and don't forget to like the video and like the book club if you do, and click on the bell and subscribe to the YouTube site, and check out my website. Thanks. If you're new to immunology, or you just want to delve into a certain aspect of this large field, and you want to get a grasp on things, you should buy my new book, Molecular Immunity, because it's a chronology of all of the important experiments and discoveries that have been made in the last 60 years. It's concise, but it's also very comprehensive. And it's the only such book that's been written since 1970. So you can buy it on Amazon, and together with the YouTube videos of the Classics in Immunology Journal Club, you can't go wrong.